Okay, I think we will get started now. Welcome everybody to this session as part of the UCD Geary Institute series of public policy seminars related to COVID and the crisis. This session today is on climate change, and I'm delighted to host this with some great panelists. And what we really are interested in talking about is how has the COVID crisis so far affected our Irish and global emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and what should we be doing, into the future now to try to make sure that we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as much as we can. I suppose the context is, and Jim Scheer, our first speaker, will get into this in a bit more detail, is that our emissions have fallen as a result of the drop in economic activity since we have had the COVID confinement, both in Ireland and everywhere else in the world. And I suppose we're interested in exploring what are the opportunities there to sustain those emissions drops. Can we reduce them further into the future? And then how will society react and cope with both the economic situation and our climate change problem or emergency? So the context of this, of course, is that we do have a climate action plan in Ireland that is quite ambitious in terms of what we've done so far to get us to our 2030 European targets. And the question, in the context of that, we also have government formation talks ongoing that are looking for more ambition in terms of climate action. And so our panelists here today will really explore, so what have our emissions done so far? What can we do in the future? Can we change our climate policy to take advantage of it? Or is there going to be any scope for that at all? And how will society react? So I'm going to introduce to you now to our four panelists. We have Jim Scheer, who is head of the Department of Data and Insights at the National Energy Agency, SEAI. And he is responsible for energy statistics, modelling, behavioural economics and finance at SEAI, and also very personally engaged in the whole climate action, let's say, fight, debate, as you have it. After that, we'll have Dr. Joe Wheatley, who is a senior researcher in the UCD Energy Institute. He specialises in climate policy and project management across our Empower project. And his background is in statistical finance and physics. And then we will have Professor John FitzGerald, who is the chair of the Climate Change Advisory Council. He's an adjunct professor in Trinity and in UCD. And he was formerly research professor at the ESRI, where he was head of the energy economics group there. And he still is also a member of the Commission of the Central Bank of Ireland. So he has a good macroeconomic background as well as energy. And then we will finish with Sadhbh O'Neill, who is a lecturer in DCU in the Masters in Climate Law. She's also a policy advisor with a Stop Climate Chaos Coalition, and she's a spokesperson for Climate Case Ireland. And she has a PhD from UCD from the School of Politics. So I hope you'll agree that we have a very interesting range of speakers. And so the way this will work is that each speaker will speak for approximately 10 to 15 minutes. We will go through the four speakers, and then we will have a question and answer session at the end. And so if you have questions as you go along, I would ask you to, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A tab, put them in there rather than in the chat bar. And at the end, then I will gather together those questions, and we can divide them up between the speakers, and I will moderate them a little bit. So without further ado, I'd like to begin. So Jim, if you'd like to share your screen with us and continue.
Thanks for the introduction, Lisa, and thanks to UCD and for all the organisation. Hopefully you can see my slides now, and I'll crack on. So I'm going to introduce essentially the latest data we have on the impact of COVID-19 measures, most notably the lockdown on energy demand and emissions, and the knock-on effects that's had on economy, sort of, and how they're showing up in the energy and emissions data. The first image here really is the scoreboard, if you like. So it's the simplest way we can illustrate energy-related CO2 emissions in terms of transport in the blue, heat in the red, and electricity in the yellow. And this schematic, I guess, gives a view of how those trends have been moving since 2005. And what you can see is that transport is the significant sector in terms of energy-related emissions, 15 million tonnes from transport and increasing over the last few years. Heat has also increased the last few years, up to about 13 million tonnes, but we're doing well on electricity, so mainly through the deployment of wind and working coal and peat off the system, we're down to 10 million tonnes on electricity. I'll say a little bit about the data that's available at the moment, and then I'll look at electricity, gas and oil, and then a couple of notes on international emissions, and others are looking at that in a bit more detail, and then a little bit of food for thought for the discussion. So in terms of data availability, the latest monthly data available for oil in particular is for March. So that's only going to catch the the first week of the lockdown period. So we've done a little modelling exercise for transport oil to have a look at how much we think the transport related emissions might have been impacted during 2020. So I'll show that as well. It's a little bit too early to make major conclusions because we need to on transport, because we need to get into that April data. But there are live dashboards available through AirGrid and Gas Networks Ireland on gas. So we've gone a little bit deeper there, and we're up to date, and we're looking at some of the April data for electricity and gas. And as I said, the next tranche of oil data really comes towards the end of May, where we get to look at April for that full lockdown period. So the first slide with data in it looks at daily demand from AirGrid, and what we've done is smooth that a little bit using a moving average just to take out the spikiness of weekends. And the first thing you notice is that in 2020, electricity demand was higher than in 2019. So the orange line there creeping above, and that's on trend. So it's essentially electricity demand, whilst the emissions have been reducing because of that extra deployment of wind and the change in the fuel mix on electricity generation, demand has been increasing year on year since about 2014. So you can see there sort of towards the end of March where the 2020 line dips below the 2019 line. In the blue line, you can also see the bank holiday weekend effect there in terms of electricity demand in April last year. And what we've seen is about, I'll just move that on, about a 20% reduction in electricity on early March, but only about 9% down on this time last year. So as I said, 2020, more electricity demand, but a sort of 20% reduction from that peak of that orange line there. And that equates to about 6.3 kilotons of emissions per day reduction compared to the first 10 or 11 weeks of the year. So less during April. You can zoom in a little bit using the data from AirGrid, and this data comes courtesy of James Glynn at Marai and the Chimera project. And there's a lot of squiggles on this line, but it's a zoom in on a day at a time kind of trend. So those familiar with looking at electricity data would be aware that there's a morning peak. So that's the first hump in the camel there, if you like, and then there's an afternoon or evening peak as well. The darker blue lines at the top show back up into February. So and the red lines down at the bottom are showing the latest weeks that we have data for in April. So again, we're seeing that 20% drop in electricity daily demand as we've come into this period. And the reason for looking at daily demand, I guess, is to compare the left with the right. The left is the weekday electricity demand, and the right is the weekend. And what's happening is, or what we're seeing is that the weekday demands and the way we're using electricity during the week is starting to mirror that of the weekend. So some interesting findings there, because obviously if we can impact that peak demand, we're reducing the some of those peaking plants, which are the less efficient plants on the system. So less activity in the evening peak. So maybe people are doing more during the day. And I think there's a lot of that in the behavioral side of things when we get down to this granular level of electricity use. So again, around that 6,300 tons, 6.3 kilotons less per day in terms of emissions from electricity. Switching over to gas, and in this chart, the blue line is the 2020 data and the orange line is the 2019 data. So what you can see towards the end of March is the 2020 trend dipping below the moving average for 2019. And that's about a 20% reduction again on gas demand for the end of March. And what you can see is the trend has come back up towards the end of April, and I'll show you the reason why I think that's happening there at the moment. So notwithstanding the weather, the demand dropped from an average daily demand of around 230 gigawatts at the end of March to around 196 in April. So it's lower in April, but it has come up there towards the end of April. And again, that equates to about 7,000 tons of CO2 less per day in April compared to March for gas demand that we use mainly for heating and some industrial processes as well. And also, importantly, for electricity generation. And that's the reason why I think the April figure there, in terms of that blue line, has crept back up. This data here shows from AirGrid, shows the difference between March and April in terms of wind. So the first thing to look at is the two red trends, and what you get to see is in the April chart on the bottom left, the red squiggly line, which is that daily profile, is a little bit lower than the March, so that's that 20% drop in demand. The blue lines then is the proportion of the electricity demand that is supplied by wind in Ireland, and in March we had about 43% of that demand from wind, or over 1,000 gigawatt hours during the month. But in April, that more than halved, and that gap was filled up by gas. So you're back to this chart where I think that's what we're seeing there in terms of the overall gas trend. We could deduce then that some of the savings are from less gas heating, but the rebound there is because we didn't have a very windy April. Looking to transport, which is perhaps where we're kind of expecting to see some of the really big changes, and starting with petrol and diesel. There's three trends on each of these charts. 2018 is in blue, 2019 is in orange, and in grey, hopefully you can see the 2020 trend just creeping up. So we have January, February and March. This is gross, GID is gross inland delivery. That just means the delivery of oil products coming from primary sources around the world into Ireland. We don't source any oil products directly here in Ireland. So it could be supplied through companies to wholesale markets, or from oil from ships and that kind of thing to the Irish market. So in petrol, we have seen declining petrol use year on year, with a shift to diesel vehicles mainly for road transport. That's mirrored to some extent here, but what we're seeing is that petrol dropped again by that 20% number in March compared in 2020 compared to the same time last year. But compared with February, it's fallen about 15%. But again, we're expecting to see a bigger dip in April, when that lockdown period really kicked off. In terms of road diesel, year on year, the trends have been pretty similar. We have seen a slight dip in diesel as well, of about 12%. I'm going to get to the emissions on oil just at the end of these few slides. Of course, the other big impact is on air travel. So jet kerosene in Ireland, again, we can see the growth over the summer period in the middle of the year, and then the tails over the Christmas period. Essentially, jet kerosene for March was 27% down on this time last year, and 5% down on February. But again, April is going to be very interesting given the huge change in the number of flights there. And obviously, I've just thrown in staycations there just as the food for thought when we get to the policy discussion and how we might look to maintain some of those savings. Oil heating is, and shouldn't say air travel at the top there, this is just a focus on heating on its own, is bucking the trend. So quite interesting, we saw a spike in heating oil in March, and quite a significant one at that. Increased by 64% compared to this time last year, and it's up 32% on February. One reason I'm suggesting for that on the right hand side is prices. So if you've been looking at the news, you've seen that oil has even gone negative on some markets because there's a supply glut. Storage is full, and there's a lot of oil floating around in the system. So the other reason, I guess, is people had some warning that the lockdown was coming, and may have all filled up their oil tanks. So 700,000 homes in Ireland on oil, So probably focus there rather than on the business side of things, but an interesting trend in oil heating. In terms of overall transport emissions, I just took a look, and Martin Howley, our head of statistics, helped us out with a quick modelling exercise here to look at how transport emissions for 2020 might pan out under one scenario. We've made a lot of assumptions here, but there's the 15 million tonnes from 2019. The majority is private road private cars. International aviation took over from road freight last year as the second biggest share of transport emissions by mode. So we flew more than we did in the Celtic Tiger period in 2018, as it happens. And now if we look at that same kind of breakdown and make these are assumptions now about how far road private car transport might have dipped. And we've said for April and May, let's say it gets down to 25% and then recovers across the period to September. For international aviation, we're down to about 10% in April and May based on our best guess. And let's say that recovers to about 70% in December. Let's say freight's down just beyond half and recovers by September. And then some of the other categories there, which we can look at later. So we're sort of assuming a sort of a bottoming out in April and May and a slight recovery. And on those assumptions, taking the 2019 and making an estimate for 2020 in terms of where we think transport emissions might be, we're seeing a full 4 million tonnes reduction on those assumptions that I just presented, which is a very sizable chunk. It's actually over 10%, it's 11% of total national energy related emissions. So that would be a very significant saving. So you can start to, but obviously that's had really significant knock-on impacts, and you know, there's the unemployment level will be high, and obviously a lot of markets closing down. So we hear more from John on the negative consequences there, even if the emission story is positive for transport, and expecting that a lot of that would rebound when the recovery begins. I've just got a quick slide here on the international picture. So the IEA came out recently with a really interesting report on 2020. They did a similar modelling exercise to we did for all sectors and for the whole planet. Biggest drop ever in emissions, back to 2010 levels in 2020 anticipated. The chart at the bottom left is very interesting. It shows the projected change in primary energy demand by fuel in 2020 relative to 2019. And you can see that fossil fuels are all on the down there. So coal, gas, oil, the biggest down, obviously for that transport, nuclear, but renewables is going up still in the face of all of this. So that's a very interesting projection from the IEA, and their report is very much worth a look. You can see some of these other huge momentous occasions like the Depression, World War II, the second oil shock in the late 70s, and the financial crisis in the 90s. And you can see that the little tip of that blue trace there dipping down much more significantly than at those times. So in terms of international emissions, this is what we wanted to see, but it's not how we wanted to see it happening necessarily. So last two slides, and just to say a little bit about momentum, and Lisa mentioned that climate action plan, which is a very comprehensive plan. 2019 was the first year that it really bit into the emissions. We're seeing about a 4% reduction in 2019 emissions from energy use, or about 1.5 million tonnes, mostly again because of less coal being used at Money Point. We've got the EU Green Deal on its way. It's going to mean bigger targets for 2030 for Ireland in terms of emissions reductions. And what the science is telling us is we need to reduce by 7.6% per annum. So post-COVID, we're hoping for transformative change. Agencies internationally like the IEA and the EU are already talking about stimulus projects. How can we maintain some of these savings? And that's part of the topic for today. And the EU Green Deal is talking a lot about a building renovation wave to get the economy going again, renewable energy projects and infrastructure moving in, and a just transition mechanism. So obviously with widespread unemployment and less income, people who need more support in that regard will need a just transition to come out of this period. And the final slide is just a little bit of food for thought for when we get to the policy stuff. I know our whole agency, SEAI, is working from home, as many of you are, and we had 120 people on a Skype call within a week of it happening, and it all went smoothly. And we're sort of, for a lot of us, it's worked out okay. And I think we're very lucky well, I feel very lucky that I'm in that bucket, and obviously for others it hasn't worked so well. But for those for whom it's working and there's no loss of quality of life or productivity, there's huge opportunities. And you've the CEOs of some really big companies like Barclays saying that the days of having 7,000 people crammed in an office building are over. Milan has announced that they're doing 35 kilometers of bike paths through the city and taking back the streets from cars. So big transformations possible in cities. And I have a question there around if we do reduce the office space in town, is there room for more housing units in city centres? So we could see a big transformation of city centres. We might talk some more about that. The EU is very well aware of the need for emergency measures here for some of the energy companies. So a lot of energy companies who are based in the fossil fuel sector are under a lot of financial pressure. So we'll see the shape of that market probably changing. And there's chat about a carbon price floor, which I'll leave to other eminent speakers on the panel to look at. But with the cost of fossil fuels so low, now might be a good time for those. So I'll leave the presentation there, and thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Jim. That was a really interesting presentation and has really set the scene nicely for where we are at right now. And I think there'll be probably lots of questions for you afterwards. But in the meantime, if you don't mind, I will move on to our next speaker, Joe Wheatley from UCD Energy Institute. Over to you, Joe.
Hi, well, it's very nice to be here. I'm going to talk about possible impacts of COVID for climate policy at EU level. I mean, obviously, there's going to be a big hole in emissions, and the question is, how big will it be, and what are the possible implications for policy? Well, we don't exactly know how this is all going to play out, obviously, but there are already a bunch of forecasts for economic growth over the next few years, and they generally have become more pessimistic. So I'll just run through a few of the scenarios and forecasts that I've used to get some numbers. So starting at the bottom there's Standard & Poor's, their forecast for April, which is more pessimistic than the one they had in March, and I think the one for May will probably be more pessimistic again. They are now forecasting 7.3% decline in growth in 2020, only a partial rebound in 2021, and then returning to sort of trend growth by 2023. McKinsey a while back had a very nice matrix of possible scenarios, depending on how well contained the virus was or is, will be, and how well the economic policy measures work. So they had 9 possible scenarios. I'll consider 2 of them here. The first one is they call it rapid containment. So they assume that the virus is contained by Q2 2020. So it's a fairly benign scenario, and that looks too pessimistic. So that would have a sharp 4.4% decline in EU growth in 2020, then a strong rebound in 2021. Sort of V-shape scenario. And the other scenario I'll consider is what they call muted recovery, where we have a very sharp decline in 2020, 9.7%, and then very poor return to growth. So you don't get back to 2019 output levels until 2023, something like that. So it's a very extended recession. And I noticed yesterday, Lagarde at the ECB is quoting numbers like 12%, maybe even 15% decline this year. So the scenarios I've got here are certainly not worst case scenarios, but there are some numbers we can work with and try to get some insight into the impact on policy. So if you look at how that translates to economic growth, I think Jim had a similar curve. You have, this is from 1990, you can see the great financial crisis there, 2009, and then I've graphed on the various scenarios that I showed you. And obviously some of them are not quite dramatic. The muted recovery brown line there is obviously a very big hole in economic output, which is being forecast. The S&P forecast is somewhere in between the two scenarios from McKinsey. That's the green line there. Okay, so what does this mean for emissions? Well, just take a very simple view of emissions based on the carbon intensity, the tons of CO2 per unit economic output. And that number has been falling in the EU since 1990. It's been a fairly continuous decline. And most of that actually is not due to policy. It's just an long-term economic trend due to growth and efficiency and so on. So there's some business as usual line for carbon intensity, which I've shown as a solid line there. And the orange area is the territorial emissions from EU 28. So the difference between the orange area and the business as usual line is you can assign to the policy effort, and that's sometimes called mu. So the difference between the business as usual line and the carbon intensity that's actually observed has been increasing with time as policies have ramped up. So basically, when a policymaker, we have a policy target of say 40% reduction by 2030, that corresponds to a certain value of mu. Then on the right-hand side there, you see the business as usual emissions applied by that simple model of emissions, and it's much flatter than what's actually observed. So we've saved quite a. So policy's job is to so the larger the larger mu is, the more costs to reduce emissions, because obviously you're making a greater effort, more investment required. So this graph shows emissions relative to 1990 for the EU. So just concentrate on the left-hand side for now. That's A1. That's a muted recovery scenario. You have a grey line that is the baseline assumption if COVID hadn't happened. And you can see the emissions are trending linearly down to 40% reduction in 2030. And then the other lines show the impact of COVID. But there's different possible policy responses. So the orange line assumes that we stick with a 40% reduction target, the current target. And you can see that that's one scenario is you simply keep your target, but it will be easier to achieve that target because there's such a large hole in emissions. The alternative policy is to keep the current policy effort the same. So you keep the same, in all the national plans for emissions reduction, we maintain all of the targets that are in there in terms of, percentage of electric vehicles on the road, percent renewables, etc. You maintain all that stuff. And then according to the simple modeling, you would overshoot your 40% target. That's shown by the red line. So that's a case where you reach your emissions target several years earlier than you expect. So obviously in the A1 scenario, the effect is more extreme than in the S&P forecast, but the same thing happens. So past 2030 here, I'm showing a linear extrapolation to net zero in 2050, and you can see that currently we're not on a trajectory for net zero emissions in 2030 with the current target, and even with COVID, right? Even if you continue all the policies we have now and you include the impact of COVID, we're still not on a trajectory for a net zero trajectory because there's still a kink in that curve. It helps, but it doesn't get you on a trajectory to net zero. So if you look at EU Green Deal, which is more ambitious, 55% reduction target, you can do exactly the same analysis again. So even though we don't have that target now, it's sort of a counterfactual. Imagine we had a 55% target now, then what would the effect of COVID be? And then you get these curves. And it's quite interesting here. If you look at the red line here on the left-hand side, the A1 scenario, you can see there's actually a downward kink in that curve. So actually you're overshooting, overcooking policy a little bit at 55% when you include the effect of COVID. You're doing slightly better than you need to do. And that's also present even in the S&P scenario. So if you consider some of these more extreme scenarios that Lagarde was talking about yesterday, there's definitely some work to do here to see whether, I'll move to some actual numbers. So if you take the 40% target and you take the muted recovery scenario, you reach your target 2.6 years earlier than you expect. So it's quite a big effect. And you overshoot your target by 3.3% in 2020. And you can also come up with a simple abatement cost curve for Europe. There's numbers in the literature for that. So it's some function of mu. And you can come up with estimates of the savings on climate policy due to COVID. So even in the continue policy option, you save about 50 billion euros according to that simple model there. But in all cases, you save money. The dollar cost or euro cost per ton CO2 is lower. So in the baseline scenario, you reach $97 per ton CO2. If you take the adapt scenarios, you maintain the 40% target, then the dollar cost is lower, $92 per ton in 2030. So you have quite significant cost savings due to that. Similar numbers for the 55% target. I won't run through them there, but they're on the slide there. So for instance, in the muted recovery scenario, you overshoot by 2.5% if you continue some set of policies designed to get to 55%. Okay, so conclusions. Well, there are definitely significant impacts for, we obviously don't know how the growth plays out, but there are going to be significant impacts for the EU policy targets, particularly for the 40% target. The milder impacts if we assume a European Green Deal, 55% target. Even without doing any numbers, there are virtually no implications of COVID at the global level for targets. That's just because we're so far off Paris goals at the moment globally that I don't think it's really a drop in the ocean compared to where we need to be. The major unknowns for policy are just how the recession plays out, whether it's a V, U shape or something worse. And then as Jim and Lisa mentioned, there are maybe sectoral impacts. In 2009, carbon intensity dropped somewhat, but it came back the next year. So there were no real long-term effects for the intensity for carbon intensity. This time, maybe there's some things you can hold on to in transport, etc., which would mean that you would have a step down in carbon intensity. So maybe some clever policies are possible there. That's it.
Thank you, Joe. I think that's very interesting. It starts as well thinking about, what the impact, first of all, of economic activity and policy on our emissions. So there's really a lot of decisions that we can make around that, but there are still, it also highlights the unknowns that can push our emissions completely off track if we get them wrong. And in our modeling, particularly the scenarios, there's a lot of unknowns basically when you're modeling out into the future, and we can try and get the decisions right, but it's very difficult to model exactly the impacts. I would say some of those results are definitely controversial and up for debate, and I look forward to hearing people's inputs on that in our Q&A session afterwards. Okay, so let's move on to Professor John FitzGerald, who is definitely at the coalface of Irish climate policy, and I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on how the COVID crisis is affecting our policy situation. Thank you.
Right. Basically, I'm talking about getting real on climate policy. All right, the COVID crisis it does have an impact, but we want to increase our long-term ambition on tackling climate change. Emissions, as we've heard from Jim, will fall by between 5 and 10% a year. Probably there may be maybe 7, say, but they're going to rebound in 2021, 2022. there may be some minor medium-term benefits like home working. I think Cork have estimated if you double the number of people home working, that might knock once off 500,000 tonnes of emissions. And there's likely to be a bit less travel. But basically, the crisis, you save emissions this year and maybe a bit next year, but you're likely to revert closer to trend after that. Tackling the COVID crisis will cost at least 30 billion in Ireland, possibly more. And that's 30 billion. That could have bought you 1 million electric cars and retrofitting 40% of Ireland's dwellings over the coming decade. And that's 30 billion we won't have. So that is going to be a major problem in terms of tackling climate change. Prioritising investment in tackling climate change is going to be an effort. And finally, the administrative resources focused on COVID are massive. The whole administration is tied up with this. And they're going to be tied up with it for some time to come. So when you ring up and say, I want to talk about climate change, you're not going to get a reply. So I think that that is a problem in the short term. How do we accelerate action? I think the past failure to act on climate change means we have an even bigger and more expensive hill to climb now. And I think that's a lesson we need to learn. But accelerating action rapidly is likely to be costly, going from 0 to 100. So staging this correctly is important. Investment takes time to implement and pay off. And I would be concerned with an effort to look for quick fixes where we actually need to prioritize investment in a range of areas if we're to deal with climate change over the coming decade, or out to 2050, decarbonize completely. And a final point on this, we need to focus on reducing net emissions. People tend to talk about the gross emissions, but actually net emissions are important, in particular in the agricultural area. Pricing carbon, it's an essential first step to decarbonising. Unless investment in decarbonisation is profitable for households and companies, it just won't happen. Telling people to be good doesn't work. You've got to incentivise them. However, correct pricing is only the essential first step, and you need a whole range of supporting policies, and that's what we need to see now. The COVID crisis has led to a collapse in fuel prices, fossil fuel prices, and the modelling done by the department showed that if you have a low fossil fuel price, you have a bigger emissions, that this has a big impact on Ireland's emissions. So this is a real negative in terms of emissions over the next 2 years, certainly. And it will result in significant increase in fossil fuel use, other things being equal. So we need to offset this. So I think it does raise the issue of the carbon price in the next budget. People's petrol and diesel are going to be, and heating oil are going to be much cheaper this year and next year than they were 2 years ago. Or a year ago. So I think we need to look at that issue. And also the EU emissions trading price, which affects the energy, that's electricity and industry, it's fallen dramatically. And I think we need to introduce a carbon price floor. And France has re-proposed this as a coalition of the willing in Europe. We should join that. And even if it doesn't happen, we should do it as well to drive carbon reduction in both electricity and industry. Agriculture, it's a third of emissions. We need to invest in changing land use. There's a win-win-win if you can raise farm income, cut emissions of methane and fix carbon, if you increase the amount of woodland on farms and also in particular off farms. And this is where the net emissions are important. Re-wetting bogs is also a major way of trapping carbon out of the atmosphere. But we need changes in the cap and other incentives to make it happen. And one of the problems about this is investment in forestry takes time to start fixing carbon as trees mature. So if we plant them all this year, it will really begin to have a big impact in the next decade. So if you're looking for a quick fix on reducing emissions in the next 3 or 4 years, forget forestry. Forget land use change. But if you're concerned about net zero in 2050, then you should be really concerned about this issue. And that's where my point about short-term fixes crowding out what the important investment is important. There are quicker wins, like you could change the type of fertilizer used on farms at relatively little cost and cut emissions by 500,000 tonnes almost overnight. And Teagasc have a range of other cost-effective good options. In electricity, it accounts for 20% emissions, the success story so far. We need to invest so we reach the 70% renewables target. And the ETS price must rise, and exporting renewable electricity can actually make a contribution to decarbonising in Europe. Transport, 20% emissions, roughly 10% of it in cars. We need to invest in public transport to shift urban car users onto urban public transport, but it takes a long time to mature. If we start implementing bus connects now, it will begin to affect emissions the second half of the decade. If we invest in Lewis and Cork and Metro in Dublin, it's going to be the 2030s that it has a big impact. That's not a reason for not doing it. It's a reason for doing it rapidly. Heavy goods vehicle, a major problem, and there's no easy solution. We need to look at quicker fixes like compressed natural gas, biofuels in that area until the technology catches up. And in aviation, we should support the EU tax proposals. There could be a boom in aviation that the people of Ireland, the households, will save between 10 and 15 billion this year because they can't spend it. Will they spend it on holidays in 2022? Ryanair are hoping they will, and that will be long term. We need to incentivize the manufacturers of aircraft to develop technologies which decarbonize aviation. Households account for heat accounts for 10% of emissions. Investing in deep retrofit, it's expensive, and the building industry can't deliver. If you were to go for 40,000 retrofits next year, that's 5,000 less houses built next year. So we need to develop the capacity of the building industry, and that will take time to ramp up. Start now if you want it to happen. And we need to look for quicker and cheaper interim measures. Changes in the heating system, I think Jim mentioned, was at 700,000 oil boilers. If we move them onto either gas or biomass in rural areas, that could make a significant difference. We could also ban the burning of coal and peat in cities, which would have significant additional health benefits. Industry is 13% of the emissions. The ETS price is too low, and we need a carbon floor price to guarantee them the price is going to rise, and they need to invest in technologies that eliminate carbon. And finally, sort of my conclusions, I think it's difficult to go from 0 to 100 in 2 or 3 years. And the recovery from the COVID crisis will see emissions rise next year. So trying to get 7% a year over the rest of the decade is going to be difficult. I think we need to aim to up our game and by investing. And we invest now, though the payback comes later. Short-term measures could crowd out investment, and we're going to have a fight to prioritize investment in reducing emissions when resources are much tighter than we had anticipated. We've had a lot of discussion on targets, but the urgent priority now is implementation. And we've discussed all sorts of targets. We want to make the targets tougher, but actually we need to discuss specific measures which we're going to implement this year and next year, which will make a difference. And the policy discussion should focus on implementing a range of measures. And we need to identify each measure, and we also need to identify the cost. This was an issue which the Climate Committee of the last Oireachtas kept on raising. Tell us the cost. You've got to be upfront with the people of Ireland on this. Some of them are going to be cheap. Some of them may save money, as has happened in renewable electricity, but some of them are going to cost money. We need to cost it, and we need to actually implement the measures. We need to see emissions falling, not because we've collapsed the economy, but because we are taking action to deal with climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. They were very practical, I think, and very specific and applied presentation on what's happening and what we can do. And I think, you know, what we're all very aware of is the risk that, you know, that we don't let happen what happened after the last recession, which was that emissions fell and then they just rose again as fast as possible straight afterwards. So your insights are very helpful there, and I'm sure we'll have more discussion of them afterwards. Okay, so then I will now move on to our final speaker, Sadhbh O'Neill, who's also going to talk about policy and society and how we can all do better. Thank you. Sadhbh, you're still muted. Oh, there
Yeah.
you go.
Sorry,
Thanks.
there we are. I just had two screens there, so I always get muddled up. So thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this. So I'm going to make a presentation that's a lot less technical. Interested, and you gave me a really interesting title as well, Lisa, what policies will be effective and also engage society, because clearly there is a relationship between effectiveness and engagement. And I think that goes some way to explaining why we have not been successful to date. The first thing is to say that, how do I get to the next slide? It's not moving for me for some reason. Okay, so the first thing to say is that a lot of the work of civil society, the coalition Stop Climate Chaos that I'm involved with, and in addition to that, the other organizations that came on board to support the asks of the One Future campaign prior to the general election, we're focused on governance, because we recognize that to make a difference in climate policy, we need to intervene in the system at a very high level. We need to ensure that we have long-term targets that are delivering annual reductions of about 8% per annum if we're serious about meeting our commitments under the Paris Agreement. And that commitment is not just about keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees ideally to prevent dangerous climate change, but it's also about doing our fair and equitable share of global mitigation. So for that, Ireland will need to step up quite dramatically compared to what we have been doing to date. We have been missing targets, we've been setting targets and not implementing them, and we have been performing quite poorly in comparison to other EU member states. But in addition to that, we have been blocking to some degree the evolution of more ambitious EU climate policy. So it's important that Irish outward-looking policy catches up and that we support more ambitious EU targets, because these will set the framework for EU-wide legislation and reforms that will then filter back down to Ireland as well. So even though it was recommended in the Joint Oireachtas Committee report and acknowledged then as well in the Climate Action Plan for 20, that was published by Minister Bruton last year, we still don't actually have a net zero target for 2050 set down in law. And what that means in practice is that the policymakers, the civil servants, the people implementing policies in government departments are working to quite an out-of-date government policy that was set in 2014 that separated out the energy emissions on the one side, essentially to do with fossil fuels and carbon dioxide, and the land use sector on the other, which didn't really get a target at all. And this policy has been somewhat updated by the climate plan, but it has not been put on a statutory footing. So it's very important, and it's one of the key demands that we have been making, that the governance framework is updated and set down in revised legislation. And it's encouraging to note that not only the Green Party has made this a priority in its discussions with the Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, but also that the response by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael to the questions of the Green Party on that particular point were very positive. So we should be expecting to see new climate legislation implemented within 100 days of the formation of government, because that is going to get everybody working towards the same goal, the same policies, with a clarity about what's expected of all the different policy actors, from government departments to semi-state agencies. And part of that package will need to include a revision of the legal mandates for key state and semi-state agencies. So working on the detail of forestry policy and agricultural policy and even energy policy, it's quite obvious that the legal mandates of those semi-state agencies prohibit them occasionally from engaging in initiatives that would be deliver more long-term societal benefits. They're very much restricted to working within the legal mandates that they have, and these need to be revised. The key area, I suppose, or the key message from the One Future campaign is that when we're looking to implement more ambitious climate policies, we need to ensure that no one gets left behind. That's a key component of the Sustainable Development Goals, but it's also core to the concept of a just transition. And in the transport sector in particularly, our approach to transport, relying on private transport to be incentivized to switching to electric vehicles, is a very limited approach. when you think of the potential societal gains in terms of improved accessibility and health and well-being and community integration, if we invest much more of our budget into public transport and active travel measures. And in fact, I copied the same photograph from Milan later. I didn't really notice that I was picking the same one that Jim had chosen, to highlight the fact that other cities are using this, rather bizarre opportunity in the lockdown to radically reorganize the public space and to take space away from cars and to shift it towards these active travel. And it's a measure that would normally be very disruptive if you had a lot of traffic on the roads. It's very difficult to make those interventions. Even drawing lines on the road can be tricky when there's lots of traffic. But at the moment, things are possible that would not normally be possible. And we should be taking those opportunities to radically change the way we manage the urban environment and traffic. We've been lobbying as well to ensure that the budget for rural transport is increased, because the message that rural communities are picking up from our climate conversations is that they get forgotten about and that we're not sensitive to the particular needs that they have and the particular challenges of getting around when you live outside of an urban area. And even in urban areas, our public transport systems are not really fit for purpose, but that's when you have them. So many communities don't have access to them at all. We have to tackle the emissions where they're coming from, and it's quite clear, and I copied the same graphs there that Jim showed us earlier from the most recent SEAI report, that the energy-related emissions from the heat and transport sectors are increasing. We're still highly dependent on imported fossil fuels, and we're making very little policy impact with the measures that have been promised over the last 10 years. The same is true really on the residential sector. It's noteworthy that discussions of things like pay-as-you-save schemes have been doing the rounds. There's been policy and political commitments to retrofitting for the last 10 years, but the delivery of these programs and the management of these schemes is very difficult for the public to engage with. There's a perception that it's going to be costly and disruptive and slow, and that the timing of these grant schemes isn't kind of working in sync with individual householders' needs. So in our work, we've been highlighting the potential for developing much more efficient retrofitting programs by focusing on local authority housing and schemes like the Energy Sprung, and the second photograph there below is from one of those schemes as was rolled out in the UK, of grouping together private retrofitting schemes in a way that lowers the cost per unit of a deep retrofit. Because the way things are stacking up at the moment, the cost to the exchequer and to the householder are really, really onerous and very high. There's also a major problem with the skills in the sector and how the demands for extra skills will possibly impede progress on rebuilding Ireland. This is a point that John has made many times, and I think it's an extremely important one. We have to manage that development and evolution of the labour market and the skills that are needed in a way that doesn't drive up the cost of building, essentially. There's also a major problem with energy standards in the private rental sector. And we've known this for a long time, but there's been a reluctance to intervene in the market because of the rising cost of rents. So we have to find ways of imposing higher standards on rental accommodation, but in a way that ensures that tenants won't be paying more essentially for it. A big area of concern for us, and this comes to the question you asked me to consider, Lisa, how to get people to engage, how to get society to engage. And the truth is that we know communities all around the country who are dying to engage in community energy projects, but who find it extremely difficult. There's huge public support for microgeneration, but it isn't currently possible to export your surplus electricity back to the grid. And even though there's been commitments made to addressing this, the policy process is working far too slowly. We still don't have smart meters. They won't be coming on stream for another 18 months or so. And there is, just kind of delays in implementing policies where there is a broad societal consensus and a sincere interest amongst the public to engage that we can't understand. So focusing on community energy is not just about delivering more renewables onto the grid, it's about harnessing public support for renewable energy, engaging communities in what we like to think of as an energy democracy, and harnessing public will to start making real changes. But the other side of it is that we know, and you guys probably have more scientific detail on this, that when people can see the source of their energy, what they're generating and what they're able to export and what different appliances are using electricity, it often motivates people to change their behavior. So until we have these smart meters and the capacity to sell electricity back, we can't expect householders to be motivated by very small changes in price of fuel. We need the right signals, and we need the right incentives. The other thing that is very important is, and I'm surprised it hasn't really come up yet, but even though Ireland's energy mix is relatively uncomplicated by the fact that we're such a small island, a small population, standalone grid and so on, we have some big opportunities to reduce emissions quite dramatically if we take the bold political decision to close the Money Point and peat-fired power stations. And I would include in that if we make a political commitment right now to ending all harvesting of peat for horticultural purposes. Now, these things just don't get mentioned by policymakers often enough, but these are very quick wins for emission reductions, and they will force us to have to think very carefully about how we map out our renewable energy pathways as well, because clearly there are energy security implications. We need to take them seriously. Nobody doubts that they are serious issues. But we need to start working towards eliminating coal and peat completely from our energy mix. And I don't think it's going to be sufficient to let the market price determine when that happens. There was an expectation last year that when the ETS price had risen, that would be the end of Money Point, that it would be, just switched off for those reasons, that the cost of the carbon permits were too high. But that's not going to be the case. Because of the various price changes that have taken place. So there needs to be a policy decision. And it's encouraging to see that in the context of government formation talks, that there is a commitment emerging to ending further gas exploration and the development of infrastructure. Because again, that forces the minds. We can't be just thinking about our domestic emissions. We have to be thinking about the upstream emissions that can be associated, that are definitely associated with fracked gas and other imports. So we need to think about doing our fair share of mitigation, and that includes our fair share of financial contributions as well. On agriculture, again, it's not just a question of implement, and I wish it were as simple as implementing the Teagasc suggestions, as John called them. It is not a proper way to do agricultural and land use policy to be suggesting things at this point when we're looking at severe biodiversity loss, chronic pollution and worsening pollution of our water bodies due to nitrates, due to ammonia emissions and particulates as well from the intensification of agriculture. So the reality is that our agricultural emissions are increasing. They don't show any sign of decreasing, and all the talk of increased efficiencies are beside the point, because it's the absolute emissions that count. And it's also, as John points out, the net emissions. And on the net side of things, our forestry model is not fit for purpose either. It is contributing to biodiversity loss and water quality problems. It is not enhancing our biodiversity. So we need to seriously reconsider both our forestry and land use models and our agricultural policies. We are going to have to look at some very clear decisions that need to be made about capping nitrogen and capping methane emissions, and we need to start to see steady declines in those gases. It is not enough to trade the perceived incumbent status of agriculture off against what has been achieved on the other side of the balance sheet from the energy and transport and heating sectors. We're going to need to see much more concrete policy commitments And we need to see that there is an approach to this that reflects the principles of a just transition so that farmers' incomes are protected. And I noticed that in one correspondence that the environmental groups received recently from the Department of Agriculture, that they have said in writing that they don't think that diversification can be anything other than market-led. And I find that very problematic, because when you have policies supported by the state to intensify the dairy herd, and yet the expectation is that diversification must be purely market-led, there is something completely wrong with our thinking. And we have to start looking at alternative ways of thinking about agriculture, where the state actively intervenes to support farm incomes and sustainable rural development. So what's stopping us? What's the problem? Why haven't we achieved what we set out to achieve when we signed up to 2020 commitments back in 2008? And I think that if you look back over the literature on climate policy in Ireland, and if you look at the graphs, it's clear that we're looking at a case of policy failure. So there's been a sense all along that Ireland has had no choice, that we are moved by, the ups and downs of economic growth as a sort of small open economy. We're just not in control of our own fate. And it creates the sense that we have no choice about policy, and that things just must be the way they are. There's also hiding behind that a perception that there are certain areas that you can't go to. You can't touch agriculture. You can't touch, peat. You can't touch this. You can't touch that. And those policy choices get left off the agenda and create the illusion that policymakers can't intervene when in fact they can. And the third area is, of course, path dependencies. If you make a long-term investment in something like peat-fired power stations, it's very difficult to reverse out of that. You're looking at stranded assets. So the decisions that we took that were bad decisions have led to path dependencies that are legacies that we have to deal with. So the very worst thing we could possibly do is repeat those mistakes by investing in further fossil fuel infrastructure that will distort our perception of policy choice and create further stranded assets or indeed path dependencies. The other problem we have is a lack of political will at times. Who are the champions of climate action in Ireland? Obviously we like to think of ourselves as champions of climate action in the environmental movement, but on our own, we can't make things happen. We need advocates in the system. We need advocates throughout all the sectors, in transport, in business, in agriculture, and in the state itself, and that they can use and leverage their influence to drive the policy changes around things where there is, in my experience, a great deal of consensus. And in politics, we call this kind of advocacy coalitions. It's the kind of sense that you build alliances strategically with other partners. And across civil society, there is an emerging consensus and coalition around the vast majority of the One Future goals. And I say the vast majority, just that the trade unions were slow to come to agreement with us on the actual date, that money point, and the peat stations should be closed. For obvious reasons, they had their own negotiations to do. But apart from that detail, there is a large degree of consensus across civil society that this is the direction we need to be going in. But it's not obvious who our allies are amongst the state agencies. And we would say that there is a lack of leadership in some agencies. There is a tendency in some of our key bodies to be kind of falling in line behind these kind of perceptions of non-negotiables that we have to talk about our emissions in a certain way. And I'll give you an example. The EPA, when it reports on the emissions every year, which is required to do under the effort sharing decision, tends to produce these graphs that just show you everything in carbon dioxide equivalents, which is one mistake, because we need to see the breakdown in gases. We need to see what scenarios are available to us to achieve our 2030 or indeed 2050 net zero targets. So just looking at the measures that are kind of locked into the policy process as if these are inevitable and that they can't be changed means that the perception is that there is no other way to go than failure to meet the 2030 targets. And that's just about presenting data. There's nothing illegal or wrong or anything else about what they're doing, but the way the information is presented suggests that there aren't any alternatives. And this is a problem. We need to see that science-based policy is at the core of the work that the Climate Change Advisory Council does. And now, John will not be surprised to hear me say this, but it has been a source of much discontent amongst the environmental community that there are so many economists on the Climate Change Advisory Council and not a single climate scientist. And there is plenty of expertise out there that wants to get involved in helping to shape government policy. But as we can see from the COVID crisis, it is absolutely essential that when you're dealing with a public health crisis, that it's medical professionals and public health experts that are giving that advice and guidance. It's up to the politicians to make the decisions at the end of the day, but the guidance should be informed by science and not just by what's considered to be cost effective. And the final thing is that all state bodies need to work towards these goals. So we need buy-in from all sectors and from all state bodies. And this is why the legislative reforms are really important. We need to have champions right across our state for climate action. It can't be left to the individual and it can't be left to civil society. And just to give you an example, I mean, I pulled this off Twitter this morning because David Connolly, the CEO of the Irish Wind Energy Association, had participated in a webinar that we did in Stop Climate Chaos this week. And just he was able to do a kind of back of the envelope calculation about how you could reduce the carbon dioxide emissions by approximately 50% by 2030. And, you know, there's a lot of innovative people out there. You can go to the internet and find 20 million tons of savings at the back of an envelope by just opening up your computer in the morning, which is amazing. But it's noteworthy, of course, that he didn't touch on the agricultural sector. And I didn't have time to develop detailed slides around this, but I just wanted to mention that, of course, in the response of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael to the Green Party's questions, they mention the recommendation by the Climate Change Advisory Council to consider a separate biogenic methane target. And this is something that we should seriously consider as long as, and the Climate Change Advisory Council said this too, that it's based on IPCC science and not any other type of science that the IFA has come up with. We need to be looking at realistic, steady declines in methane emissions. But if those declines are at a slightly lower rate than the declines in carbon dioxide emissions, my understanding is that that will actually deliver a net benefit to the atmosphere, which is what's ultimately important. We can't expect things like hedgerows and soils to compensate for the emissions from ruminant livestock. It just is not possible. But there is an awful lot that can be done there using the models that have been developed in New Zealand. So I know you're running out of time there. Just to finish off, the last thing I would say is that when we're looking to the sort of conversations that are going to be taking place to shape policy after this pandemic has hopefully passed, we need to think about whose voices are represented at the table. Our sense is that there's a lack of agency in communities that's been compounded by the fact that we don't have a functioning government. We don't even know who the opposition is. It's very difficult for people working at community level and in advocacy to get a hearing at the moment. A lot of processes have been shut down and you can't get face-to-face meetings. So the solutions to a lot of our problems are going to need to engage citizens actively in the process. And for that, we're going to need to kind of reimagine our social contract. We need to think about the boundaries of state intervention and where individuals need to step up. We can see that people are willing to make sacrifices for the public interest. This lockdown that we're experiencing is not being enforced by the Gardaí. We are enforcing it ourselves in the collective interest. So the goodwill is there to be harnessed, but as long as it's being developed and communicated clearly the way it has been in the case of the pandemic. I'm concerned about the future of the labour market. We don't have time to get into this, but the effect of digitalization and the shutdown combined leaves a huge problem for younger generations who've been locked out of both the housing market and now increasingly the labour market. And as we look to solutions for the future, it has to be fair intergenerationally to ensure that we're not cutting the next generation out of the conversation. And finally, just to say, we haven't gone away. We have been mobilizing online. We've been having great fun lobbying our TDs and politicians since the election with all kinds of new tools that are available to us, which is really quite extraordinary. But we have to remember that there's a generation out there of young people who can't vote and who have normally organized themselves at school and through their own networks, who are now also in lockdown in their homes. And they want their voices heard. They want to be represented in this conversation. So we've been mobilizing around the general election and since then, and it's clear to us from our experience that the environmental issues and climate change is growing in salience, that we are getting more and more engagement from the public than ever. But we need to translate that into political power and into political action. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Sadhbh. Some very interesting points there, a lot to think about. So we've had some good questions coming in for our panel. Before I get on to those, it struck me that I didn't introduce myself at all, just so you know who you're dealing with here. I'm Lisa Ryan, and I am a lecturer in Energy Economics and Policy in the School of Economics and in UCD Energy Institute. And we also have with us Liam Delaney, who is Professor of Behavioural Economics and is leading this seminar series for the Geary Institute. So just so you know who you've got here, and Emma Watson's online as well, sorry. Okay, so let's get on to some of the questions and answers. We've received quite a lot, so my challenge is to try and get through some of them before our time. I think if it's okay, we'll run until 1:30, if that's okay, Liam. Just because we did have 4 speakers, so these things take a little bit longer. So I have a few kind of more technical questions, specific clarity for Jim. And I might just begin with those because they're probably the most straightforward. Jim, there was a question there on, the hour change, is that included? And also, have you looked at data centers and the impact of home working there?
The data I showed on electricity demand was straight from the EirGrid website, so it'll include any reductions that have happened because of the clock change. They're usually fairly small, but they do exist, but they're embedded in that much bigger change that's due to the lockdown measures. And that kind of weekend approach to using electricity, being more true during the week. So I'd say that much on that one. In terms of data centers, Host in Ireland and BitPower, the industry groups around data centers are saying 20 to 30% increase in data center activity over the period. So webinars like this and our new working regime has gone online. Now the system is probably there to cope with that, but that's certainly a consideration for future in terms of increased emissions in one area in lieu of perhaps the reduced journeys on the transport. I can probably cover off a few of the other questions that I've read there, Lisa, in terms of specific questions about specific technologies like greening the gas grid, like hydrogen, like offshore wind. I think the overarching message there is that the deep cuts that are needed, 7 to 7.6% per annum, will require all comers, all solutions to be considered. I think what we need to do is, and we have the climate action plan with that full 180 action list. What John was talking about there in terms of acting now and not making sure that the short-term quick wins that we go for don't crowd out those long-term investments, I think is really key. A lot of the actions on the list are no regrets. And there are just different estimates about how deep savings they'll provide in terms of emissions by 2030 and in the longer term. So we need to get really clear about how deep to go on each measure and where we can be sure that we go down a pathway of no regrets. But it's clear that the level of cuts that are needed, that 7.6% per annum, is going to need all of those options to be pursued and all in really quick time. And my final point would be on targets. I think the chat on targets has gone on for a long time, and I think what we're seeing now with this, with the 7 to 7.6% number is a glide path to decarbonisation that is understandable. I think it's communicating a lot more. And I think if we start communicating in the same metrics, like last year in 2019, we reduced energy-related emissions by about 4%. It needs to be higher than that. It needs to be 7.6. And the longer we don't hit that target, the quicker that number increases. So I would disagree with Sadhbh on some of the reporting from the EPA. I think they're really strong in terms of the messaging, in terms of, you know, this is how we're going and this is what the targets are and this is how far we are behind. But I think there are definitely more creative and simple ways to illustrate what we need to do and what we've done in the previous year, and compare and contrast those. So I've had a couple of examples of those on the slides with some fairly simple graphics, but certainly delivering these reductions is not simple. And it's going to take a huge coordinated effort across all of government, including central government, as has been called for. But I think the momentum is there now, and we need to keep it going and press the accelerator big time. Okay, that's great. Thank you. There's been a few questions about investment and the stimulus packages that are likely to come. And I might pass some of these to John. We could bundle them together in terms of, you know, what about, so can we get people to maybe invest? What are the incentives probably that would help people invest in, say, retrofit in their own home? So we'll have a lot of savings. So it's not just stimulus mechanisms, but also, as you said before, people are saving a lot right now because they're not out and about. And then also stimulus packages. What are the near-term measures we can get? Christopher Dixon O'Mara asked in the near term, so we can really start working right away. Some of the land use ones are more longer term, but the short-term ones are the ones there that we could invest in right away.
All right, just on the savings issue, this year, Irish people, we can't spend our money. And the government has actually transferred almost the same amount of money that people are losing in transfers to households. So actually, household income isn't down much. Consumption is down a huge amount. It's the same in Britain. Ireland, Britain, household savings will rise by about 8 percentage points of national income. In Germany, it may be 4 or 5. Across Northern Europe, this is happening. What happens after the crisis is over with these savings? In the Second World War is the last time this happened in Ireland, that consumers were rationed. We couldn't buy energy, we couldn't buy clothes, we couldn't buy any goods. Instead of spending the money on other things, people saved the money. And after the Second World War, they went out and spent as if there was no tomorrow in 1946-47. My concern is that, that a lot of the savings could go to Ryanair in 2022 and 23, the people who haven't been able to holiday. And you could, so it's a question of how you attract some of those savings. My concern is it's household savings, so it would seem obvious that you would accelerate retrofitting dwellings. But the problem is the capacity, and SEAI, and we're on the same page on this one. We recommended last year that you begin with programs for local authority dwellings to build up capacity in the building construction industry. And in the budget, in the climate action plan, and in the budget in the autumn, there were initial things done on that. But the building construction industry is going to be under pressure to deliver houses and all the investment we're not doing at the moment. So I'm not sure what's going to happen. I'm a bit worried that these savings, which could go into decarbonising, may not. They could be spent on cars, for example. Now, electric cars may be a bit more accessible in 2022 than they are now. So maybe that some of it could be sidetracked into alternative investment. But also, people talk about a stimulus. The stimulus has been given to households. And it's not that there's going to be a major increase in investment across Europe. My concern is that the governments are indebted. Households are less indebted after this crisis. So delivering the EU Green Deal is going to be difficult, and making sure it happens in an effective way to decarbonise Europe is a concern.
Okay. So Jim, I think you want to just mention something briefly there. Yeah,
just to add a little bit to that, because I think all of those stimulus ideas, like the retrofit of the local authority stock, the volumes of retrofits that we need to get done across heating the building sector to reduce that heating demand, I think they all still stand as ideas. The other big ones like district heating will take significant investment and will be job intense, and I think they still need to be very much on the agenda. And I think we're well aware now of those kind of issues in terms of getting the supply chains ready for that, and building the skills and the capacity to do that. I think what's really important is that we communicate what we think people should do, or what we think the solutions are at the right time. So this is a really big moment of change, and we've got behavioural science experts on this call at SEAI with a behavioural economics unit, because the engineers and the economists hadn't sorted out this climate change problem on their own. And we were really clear that like what we have to do at this critical point in time is provide people with the right solutions at the right time, so that if they do have some savings, that they spend it in the areas that we think will have the biggest impact. And it loops back to some of those conversations about microgen and those kind of things, that whilst they're quite engaging and they get people into the conversation, they're likely to have a less impact on overall emissions than, for example, getting the fabric right. And if people are spending money on microgen and not on fabric, well, then they mightn't have the money to do the kind of measures we need on the heat side. So we really need to balance the solutions and make sure that what limited savings people do have, they're supported in a way to spend that in the areas that we think will have the biggest impact on climate. So I would say that it's great that we're having these conversations, not just from an engineering perspective or an economics perspective, but also very much from that human interface. And also you're seeing the political sphere come in as well. And so the interplay of all of those things, I think at this critical moment of change is really like, that's what we have to get right. We have to have all of these ducks in a row to get the impact we want. We've seen that the SEAI programs, that the demand for our programs, we had huge pipelines in our programs, and because the supply chains have stopped working at the moment, there's some issues there, but we have more demand than we do supply in terms of grants and supports. So there's certainly an appetite out there, and we expect to see that come back when the measures are relaxed, and so I think that's really healthy, and we need to make the most of that as we go.
Okay, I'd just like to turn back. There's a few questions here for Sadhbh in terms of, well, I suppose following on from that particularly, I suppose is there a way in the just transition to be looking at some of that employment? There's going to be huge unemployment, I think, unfortunately, in the recession that's coming towards us. Is there a way of alleviating some of those skills shortages that John has mentioned, and maybe retrain? I don't know if this is outside your area exactly, but it's part of the kind of the wider picture, I think. And then there were other questions of, if we could start including agriculture more in the presentation of how our emissions mitigations options are, would people be more likely to do more on the easier options once they see the range of difficulty that we have if we present all the options? So there too. And then there was one from Jean Moore on if we can think about taking opportunities, in sustainable transport based on remote working. These are kind of more clear to us, but are there other sectors or areas where benefits might be captured as well, and capture the public imagination on this before we kind of get back to so-called normal? So there are a few hard ones for you, Sadhbh. Or anybody else afterwards.
Firstly, I'm sorry that I went on so long in my presentation. I had no idea that I was taking up so much time. Just on the just transition, worth recalling that ICTU produced a very interesting paper last year about the just transition and the potential for job creation. And they looked at the employment potential from retrofitting. I think they came up with a figure of about 19,000 potential new jobs. Another figure of about 4,000 potential new jobs from microgen. It focused on those areas that would be affected by the closure of Moneypoint and Peat. So it's really exciting to see that the trade unions are engaging with this. We do have a very interesting model that has been implemented under the Climate Action Plan with the Just Transition Commissioner. I mean, there's some aspects to the way that was set up that it might not be replicable nationwide, but I think that there will be some very interesting results from that work. But the whole idea is that the Commissioner, Kieran Mulvey, has been tasked with basically working with the other agencies in the Midlands to precisely achieve that, develop some job creation, upskilling, and tie it into the retrofitting needs in the area. So that's one thing where I think there's actually probably a lot of progress being made, and I think we just need to make sure that we're ready to move in with the resources and the decisions that are needed, because some of these job losses are happening much more quickly than were originally anticipated. Now, if I can remember the other question on
this is other opportunities maybe on biodiversity, where people now maybe see the benefits of less traffic or other.
Yeah, you see, I mean, if you're talking, when I'm talking with other environmentalists about agriculture, we have a completely different conversation than the one that happens in the policy sphere. The policy sphere is very much like the only options available to us are the implementation of the Chagas-Kamak curve, which is a very, very narrow set of policy options. And there's a lot more that we could be doing. There's a lot that's happening in the context of CAP reform negotiations. There are some very interesting pilot examples of life projects and examples of regenerative farming throughout the country. And we need to learn the lessons of what is working for those farmers on the ground. People in the context of this lockdown crisis are starting to appreciate how unsustainable and insecure it is for us to be importing 80% of our food. And people are seeking out local suppliers and trying to support local farmers who are not able to sell their produce at farmers markets at the moment. So there are experiences that we can learn from, just, that are evolving as we speak. It's difficult to turn that into numbers. It always is, but it is right throughout this conversation to say, well, if we do this, it'll result in so much emission reductions. But what you're looking at is making interventions in a complex system that have a kind of cascading effect. So it's difficult to model that, because you're looking at people's behavior, their willingness to engage, maybe some degree of sacrifice, maybe some degree of change of expectations, and alongside that, a kind of more government-led, system-led set of changes. But absolutely, the agricultural conversation, we really need to broaden that out beyond herd size.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Then I have a nice one for Joe. Difficult on economic growth. And I suppose the questions come in on, so we're assuming that there will be economic growth. Are there any models showing a way of somehow sustaining, and what is the term used, so that we basically don't have such growth, that we talk about decoupling climate emissions and economic growth, but it hasn't really ever succeeded in reducing greenhouse gas emissions further enough. So should we be thinking about, a different structure to our economic system that is more, controlled gradual contraction, as it was put? Any thoughts on that for your modelling? Or do you see any models out there? I'm sorry, you're still muted as well.
Yeah, well, that's the old degrowth thing. I mean, I guess we're all in the business of getting the emissions intensity, carbon intensity down, using technical solutions in one form or another, maybe some behavioral changes. The other school of thought is degrowth, that, we can't have this type of economy. There aren't technical fixes. So I guess we're all in the former camp. So I'm not a degrowth person. Obviously, we're doing a natural experiment at the moment. But I would say that we don't know how this goes yet. We're not actually, we don't know if we're really coming out of the crisis. And John is very optimistic about a strong rebound next year, and the stock market is saying the same thing. It's going to all rebound very hard. The stock market is definitely saying that, but there are words of caution, because it's an epidemic we don't actually fully understand, and there may be second waves and so on. So we don't actually know that how we get out of this current crisis. So we might be going a bit. It's possible we're going a bit more in the degrowth side of things than it looks at present, as I tried to say in our presentation. But personally, I think everything that's been described today is about getting the intensity of our activity, of our carbon intensity of our economic activity down, and that's where we should be focusing our efforts. I don't think degrowth is it's going to be a pleasant experience for us in the next couple of years.
Okay.
Could I just add to that, Lisa? I think
sure,
that's
go ahead.
A really interesting question, but I think the answer is kind of, in a way, can be brought back to the pure and simple fact that we have a carbon budget that we need to meet over the years. And so whatever about degrowth or growth, we now have a line that goes out to 2050 that is a cap on emissions. So if you could look at that as a rationing or a budget kind of approach, you really have to say, well, next year we have to be 7.6% or 7% down on emissions from last year. And if we don't do that, we have to be even further down the following year after that. So it then becomes a question of not how is the economy going as the first point of call. And I'll finish this on a point on just transition, but I think the first point is, what do we have to do next year in terms of the activity rates and efficiency of cars, of heating, of our electricity. And once you've covered that off, and then made sure you've looked after the most vulnerable in society and making sure you're working on getting people to work and all those kinds of things in line with that. But the start of the conversation is, how do we get the emissions down by as much as we need to make our fair share contribution to the climate crisis? And that's where I'd start that conversation on growth, would be from there.
Thank you. Just the last comment, John?
Yeah, just it's a very good article in today's Financial Times by Tim Harford, and he says, if degrowth is the only solution we can find to our problems, perhaps we haven't looked hard enough. I think that we need to decarbonize, and we need people to buy into it, and degrowth is not going to make them do so. Just on agriculture, we need to significantly reduce the number of cattle in this country, and we need to plant a lot more land with trees. But I'm just a nerd. My job is to be a nerd in the Climate Change Advisory Council, but I've actually spent a lot of time going out and talking to the farming community. And if you go and tell farmers to get rid of the cattle and their plant trees, they go wild with rage. And taking the points which you made, Sadhbh, about engaging with communities, we've got to talk to the farming community and see, actually, I think they can be persuaded to do what was needed. But it's the language. So going out and saying, you're to get rid of your cattle, you're onto a loser. Going out and saying, you could make more money if you change how you're doing things, and we will encourage you to do so and help you, I think you're likely to get more action.
Okay, that's I think a positive point at the end there. And I'm afraid we are going to have to wrap up. I'm conscious that all our speakers and also the participants have been online a long time. There have been many more questions, I'm afraid, that we haven't got to. So I'm sorry to the participants who have put in questions that we haven't got to. But there have been a few very positive comments asking that we repeat such a session in a few months' time, perhaps in person with the Geary Institute. I certainly would be delighted to continue this conversation. And there will be a recording, and hopefully the participants will be able to pass over their slides that we can put online. And it's all available on the publicpolicy.ie website that we will have afterwards. And in the meantime, I would like to really thank all the speakers very much for your time and interesting different points. And also to all of you who've participated remotely online today, and your questions that have also stimulated an interesting discussion. So thank you very much, and goodbye for now. Clap, clap. Okay.
Thanks.